Hello, everybody. Welcome to LudoNarraCon 2020. We're at the Transformational Experience panel. Along with me are these awesome panelists and developers. In this panel, we're going to explore the games and these developers that utilize this very unique medium to create meaningful experiences about real-world problems, provoking thoughts, increasing awareness, and making an emotional impact to change the world for the better. So yeah, in these discussions, we'll kind of venture into the souls and trying to figure out why and how this is happening. And start with a brief introduction from each of our panelists. Start with Paula.
Hello, hi, I'm Paula Rogers. I was the writing lead and story editor on NeoCab. I'm really excited to talk about this stuff because we had a lot of emotion in NeoCab, and it was one of the main mechanics of our game, so it feels really relevant to be on this panel.
And can we have Jörg pick up next?
Sure. Hi, I'm Jörg. I'm founder of Paint Bucket Games, and we just made a game called Through the Darkest of Times. And I did most of the writing and the design, and yeah, it also feels really relevant to talk about this because it's a game about fighting Nazis with a historical background. Yeah,
that's pretty awesome. And Ziba.
Hey, I'm Ziba. I've been running Pop Cannibal for 10 years. My friends Luigi and Clark and I just made Kind Words, Lo-Fi Chill Beats to Write To. Game about writing letters, which people wrote over 1 million letters in the last few months. So I'm excited about being in this space here with transformational games and all these people putting their hearts into it.
Thank you so much for that. And Alex?
Hello, I'm Alex Paterson. I'm one of the founders of Not Games, based in London, and we have just released in January into early access Not for Broadcast, which is an FMV dystopian TV simulator. So I'm super excited to be here to talk to you guys, as yeah, our game is all about choices and consequences and narrative twists and turns. So yeah, super excited.
Thank you for that. Matthew.
Matthew, I work at Zectronics, where I do story and sound and music. And most recently, I wrote the visual novel Eliza, which is about AI and therapy and getting therapy and so forth, and technology applied to that. So it's a very personal story, even though it's not necessarily specifically about me. So I think that this is a pretty appropriate way to kick things off.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I'm Atta. I work on Suzerain. It's a political narrative drama. It mainly delves into the psychology of power, corruption, greed, and all that stuff. Yeah, we made this with the Torport Games team, founded 2 years ago. And yeah, I want to be here and with these awesome people to kind of talk about why this game came to be, and also learn about other developers and why they're doing these emotional and transformational experiences. So we can kind of lead on to some key influences from your lives. Can you name 1 or 2 things that kind of impacted you, that led to these games? Like, what are the topics or things that you kind of noticed that, helped you create?
I guess I'll start. Eliza is about getting therapy, and it takes place in Seattle. And it's about someone who works in the tech industry. And it's about someone who's kind of trying to decide what she's doing with her life next, after burning out a little bit, after working in tech for a while. And all of those things are, I think, maybe pretty obviously, now that I'm presenting them this way, are things that I've experienced as well. And so the story of Eliza, even though it's fictional, incorporates a lot of elements from my own life and from the observations that I've made, including the people that I talk to who work in the tech industry here in Seattle, including kind of the mental health apparatus that we have and the ways that we seek help for that, and then also just working too hard at a company and then kind of like trying to decide whether you still want to do that or not.
Anybody want to continue with that?
I mean, I think yeah, go for it.
Okay. So, well, our game is about fighting Nazis, historical Nazis in Berlin, and something I realized while making this game is that how much this kind of history has always influenced me and was always around me much more than I thought before I started working on the game. I realized that the house I grew up was always full with history books, and especially this part of German history was something that, yeah, I don't know, influenced my family and probably influenced, I guess, the whole country, and traumatized everyone around us down to still me in the third generation after this all happened. And so actually, even though you know so much about it and you saw so many movies and read so many books, making a game about it and collecting all this information and talking to people, to witnesses, that stirred something up and was really, yeah, that was made it a very personal experience, just making it at one point.
So it kind of like, touched on that aspect, like, you can see elements that, we draw from our lives that kind of influence the creation directly. Paula.
So I think for us, I know there were a lot of themes, some similar to what Matthew mentioned around encroaching technology and the dangers of the gig economy and dehumanizing labor. But I think for us on NeoCab, we were always united by our theme of stay human, and ironically exploring that in like this city that's been overtaken by AI and technology. How do you stay human, and how is it more important than ever to find ways to carve out that humanity? And so for us, the emotional system, the emotional labor of a gig worker like Lena, and just the emotional connection of something like seemingly so fleeting, like an interaction with your Lyft driver, like just how much impact that can have on a person's life, and how much you can really get to know about a stranger just in the course of like a 5-minute conversation, was something that I think really drove us. And that kind of reminds me of Ziba's game. I wonder if there are like similar themes for you.
Yeah, it's one of the simplest reflection, which I love that everybody's talking about, sort of how their games are reflections of these lenses of seeing the world through their experience, and not specifically other games. It's fine to make games inspired by other games, but I think what sort of groups some of these games together is that they're coming from these places of I see the world and I need to reflect it or process it for myself, which is really cool. And for Kind Words, a lot of it was everybody seems to be jerks right now, and I don't think that's true, right? Like, it seems like people are ready to exclude each other or push each other out, especially American politics. Trump's insane. We're putting kids in cages. Are people really like this? And so Kind Words was this reaction of like, I see the world this way. I want to believe it's better, and I'm going to give it a chance to be reflected through my game in a way that I think we really can. And that's for me what it's shown, is that it did bounce back, that no, there's a whole lot of goodwill out there and people want to care for each other. So that was a big part of the whole reason to make Kind Words, is to reflect what I hoped was out there.
It's interesting that you mentioned sort of Trump and the world right now. That's kind of where we started from, is that we, again, like a lot of the games here today, are exploring dystopia. And I wonder if other people feel the same, that since 2016-ish, the world has kind of been careening into its own sort of dystopia, which makes writing all this stuff actually quite hard because it keeps happening in real life. But we was kind of, I like that with like NeoCab and Kind Words, you guys are exploring like the small interactions between people that kind of reflect those things, whereas we tried to go for a much more broad, grand thing of, you're in control of the media, and where not just are people dicks, or will they be kind to each other? It's like, where are the lines between those two things? You know, I think we're learning more and more about this massive political spectrum that exists in the world, and where are those lines and grey areas between what's acceptable and what isn't, and where people fall on those lines is something we're trying to dig into a little bit.
Yeah, like that kind of really kind of ties into our game as well, because in the primary inspiration of Suzerain, there are many. I mean, it's a human experience. We're kind of diving into our own issues as humans, of like the problems, like we want more, we want better, we want faster, like this constant more and more and more thing. But we got very much inspired by our experiences in Turkey as a development team, because we kind of saw the political instability, the protests, the very rough side of life, and we were kind of left with the question of why is this happening? Like why? And this is not just about a certain area or a country or a time period that we, have the chance to live in right now. This is a problem that has existed for thousands of years. Why? Why is this happening? So there must be something in us that draws us to these things. There must be conditions that push humanity in this spectrum to those things. So in Suzerain, you kind of explore these avenues, and you don't have to do it. It's just a part of the game. It's a path that you can take, where you can understand why people do make these choices and why they're so, like they kind of pull you in a way. So politics does have a big influence in that game. And from there, we can kind of talk about how the games that we make recreate, or the conditions in these games, how they apply to these experiences. So what did you do to focus on that subject? For example, for Paula, it was about human emotion and connection. So how does NeoCab do that?
Well, just from a mechanic standpoint, we have the field grid, which is a biofeedback device that Lena wears. That's kind of like a super advanced mood ring that tells where her emotions are. And that is determined kind of by how the player shepherds Lena through various interactions and getting to know this character. So we wanted to kind of hone the player's ability to have this emotional sensitivity from the get-go, from the very beginning of the game, because that's how you play through Lena. But then also it's such a key part of how you navigate not only the PAX passengers that you pick up, but also in the final showdown, the boss battle with your friend Savvy. And so we tied the field grid to the branching in the game. So it was really important to us to not make any emotion seem bad, but make every emotion just have different consequences. So sometimes Lena gets in the red, which is kind of crudely anger or frustration, but that's not necessarily bad. It doesn't automatically close off options for you. Sometimes that's the way, for instance, to win the game. So spoilers. Yeah. So we were really trying to be mindful of the fact that emotion is just raw energy and not editorialized too much, while also kind of calling attention to the fact that we are all emotional creatures all the time in our lives. And so it does have an impact on us. And my last point that I'll make about that is just that we wanted to, kind of going back to what I was saying earlier about these bigger forces that are at work in the game around techno-capitalism and Capra taking over and surveillance, these forces and we're all talking about with our games can seem overwhelming, and how do you fight that? But I think for us, making emotion its own kind of power and its own kind of currency in the game, and these small interactions between people, seeing how they have this big impact, for us it was that our kind of answer to there is a way to fight against these seemingly larger than life forces.
Mm-hmm. And Alex, how did you use the media and like kind of see the media in the real world and kind of transform that in not for broadcasts? Like, what elements did you use? Like, what is the core of that experience?
Well, we discovered fairly early on that the kind of core feeling of playing the game is quite stressful. That the more sort of elements and multitasking we were piling on people, the more stressed and freaked out they got. So we sort of liked that and decided that to use that as an important tool to kind of back up the narrative that we're trying to explore. But interestingly, going back to what Paula said about emotions, one of the things that really, because originally I know a lot of people won't have understand the game. So in a level, you're editing the news. So you have 4 screens and you're editing a news broadcast as live TV. And originally that was the game, and every level would be a different night of the news. But what we found was, because it was the news, you were sort of the invisible editor sitting in a control room somewhere, and you weren't really seeing the effects that it had on you. So what we did then was, between each section, you would go home and talk to your family, and it was all done through text, but you would then see the consequences that how you were portraying the world was having on you. And I think that really helped us unlock that something there about those emotions, is when we made it personal, because before, the story we were telling was very external, and you were sort of a passive person watching your effect out on the world. But it really brought something new when we brought that and made it an intimate, personal family story as well. So that was really important to us.
And that kind of is also interesting in Eliza, where you have that job aspect of the story, and then you have that personal side with your friend and, the app, Matthew, that was created. Yeah, would you want to explain a bit about how you kind of created the game around what you've experienced, and like, what elements are there in there?
Yeah, I think having the job aspect of like getting doing therapy for people and experiencing that aspect of it, as well as talking to people about what you're doing, and kind of going back and forth between those things, was really important. I think, like Alex said, you want to see the effect of the thing that you're doing in the world in addition to actually doing it. I think that, as a visual novel, Eliza is actually quite linear for most of the way through it. And part of that is to reflect the story, which is that the main character, Evelyn, is kind of just being pulled along through this thing that she's experiencing, and doesn't necessarily make any choices, any big choices, right up until the very end, where she makes one very big choice about what to do next. And I think that kind of reflects, in a lot of ways, the mental space that you're in. When you're working at a job, you don't necessarily have like lots of agency and choices in your day-to-day life when you're just working a job and then coming home and talking to your friends. And so the kind of the narrative design space of the visual novel kind of dovetails with the mental space that the main character is in, and works together pretty nicely. So that lack of choice and that sort of being pulled along is a deliberate design decision that I made to try to kind of evoke that feeling.
Yeah, so and it has been successful.
The narrative and the gameplay sort of went together, I guess.
Yeah, and it has been, like, I think whenever I played it, I just want to comment on that, because it felt like it was also addressing the fakeness of work and everything, and that really it made an impact on me, the way it was worded and what you were trying to get across. I immediately understood it, so very well done. Yeah,
cool.
Yeah, Jörg, you want to tell us a bit about how you kind of put that period in through Darkest of Times, and how the resistance works, and what the emotional, personal elements are?
Yeah, this I can relate to the taking away some deciding to take away some agency from the player. Like for us it is because it is the game is based on these true stories, on these true civilian resistance fighters that did exist, even though the ones that you play are fictional and are always created procedurally. Yet our goal was that they are real enough that you can say, like, yes, this person might have existed and this group might have existed. So therefore, it was clear for us that you wouldn't be able to change history in the way that we think of changing history, especially in games, right? We are used in games that as player you have full agency and you can change everything. It's civilization, right? You would change the entire how the world goes, or in I don't know, Hearts of Iron or so, you change the entire path of the war and so on. And that was something, as playing as a civilian, as a normal citizen, you wouldn't be able to do that. So these events would always stay the same. There was like this follow timeline, yet we needed to give you enough agency and something that you feel what you're doing is not pointless, right? Because that is also, I think for us, this was always an important, that is the main message of the game. Even though, yes, you cannot change the entire world, you might not be able to kill Hitler and stop World War II or whatever, but if you help this one person in this one moment, that is enough. You're done good, you know. Mm-hmm. And that was a challenge that I really underestimated in the beginning, because you have this, like, we had this like strategy set up that felt like it was asking for giving people a measurable success, right? So if you give people numbers to play with, people expect that their numbers will tell them if they are doing good or not. And then if you have this whole scenario, which always leads to, you know, disaster in one way or the other, that was tricky in a way. And our escape was that we then covered everything in narrative. So basically, whenever things went down, say no matter how far you get, and then your group might dissolve and everyone gets arrested, or you might actually survive the entire time. Doesn't matter. You always get an epilogue for every person that was in your group, like a short, procedurally generated, small 3-sentence thing, which tells you, like, okay, Hans went to the Eastern Front and then he died, but Marta, she survived, went to the US, became a famous artist. And so, like, the story of your group, no matter how far you get, is always, you always have a feeling of closure. And you don't go from the game away and say, like, okay, I did this wrong, I need to play again to beat it. But rather with, like, okay, I created this story about a resistance group, and this story ends here. And if I play again, I have a different story. That at least was the design goal. Not sure if it works for everyone.
Yeah, but that's very well put. And yeah, like, sometimes even just helping a little is all we can do. And I mean, that matters, right? And it's nice to point that out. And talking about helping people and saving lives sometimes, Ziba, we want to talk a little bit about how Kind Words is connecting people, because you guys aren't necessarily creating content in a way, you are connecting people together, right?
Yeah, hearing all my fellow panelists and how hard they worked on their clever narratives, it just sounds exhausting. We left the bulk of the writing up to the players, right? It's right. I mean, it's odd for a narrative game. Our game has you experience it almost primarily through text and through stories, but there are other people's stories. But we did, so a whole lot of our effort went into framing everybody's mindset and how they come in there. Similar to what Paula talked about, how it was important to express emotions, to accept the expression of emotions in a range as a positive function of the game. That's something that Kind Words is part of the balancing act, is that people come in often in a bad place, in a bad state. They're upset. Everybody has stress. And the game is supposed to be this shiny, happy, wholesome thing, but it's not selling escapism. It's selling self-reflection and volunteering to help others. And so when you come to it, it's not saying put aside your bad moods. It's saying come, bring and explore your bad moods. So there has to be room in the way that the game is constructed for people to not feel this dissonance where they're like, I hate myself, or I'm absolutely angry at this other thing, and they need this media experience that is there with them and not saying like, hey, it's just time to be all happy flowers. That's one of the specific ways that sort of plays out is like language filters. And this is something people question, people in the game. So you write requests for letters, and then people respond with advice, right? And so, and then you can report anything. That's part of the moderation. And people will report dirty words, curse words, and they say, is this supposed to be here? This game's so wholesome and so happy. But strong language is a part of strong emotions. And we found that anytime we attempt to do any sort of level of filtering, just to check how people are using strong language, it was useless. It's always F cancer. It's shockingly adult. Kind Words is a shockingly mature game in both sense of you bring a mature level of discourse and their mature topics, but it's not about selling sex or violence. I don't know.
Yeah, that's very that's very interesting. I did play that game, and it was quite interesting to connect to people that I don't know, and everybody had a goodwill. I was surprised by the amount of good messages in that, because immediately, I mean, as mentioned before, we always keep focusing on the negative, on the bad, and there's so much good in humanity, and I think that game kind of shows that. And I can explain a little bit about how we do it in do create game conditions in Suzerain that kind of reflects our artistic vision. Suzerain is set in a 1950s fictional universe, and this is a very like deep and rich universe of different countries, cultures, and places. Obviously, you can find influences from our life if you look deeply and carefully. And the player is Anton Rayne and is in charge of a country called Sordland. This country is like had a troubled past, had civil wars and rough periods. And you as a player are pushed into this role, and you suddenly find yourself in charge of an entire nation, managing the economy, the diplomacy, the reforms or not, and a lot of the aspects. But how we ground everything, how we make everything more personal is we do everything through characters. So we really focus on the ministers, your family, your children, your friend, to kind of make sure the experience is very real and very personal, instead of just, using abstract layers or numbers. And the whole situation in the country and your choices changing the outcome of what is happening throughout the game kind of puts you in the shoes of power, but also you're dependent on other people executing your will. So we are also kind of playing through the idea of you need other people to do what you want. No matter how powerful you are, you're bound to others. And after that point, we add morality on top. So are you trying to go the good way? But sometimes, there's so much resistance that you could, cut corners here and there to make some change. But then is the change you want to make big enough or good enough, right? Or are you going the other way, exploring, saying, well, I have power, why not utilize it? And then we take the player through the journey of, in a realistic, obviously, the environment and the characters and everything supports this. This doesn't come out of nowhere. But we kind of take that journey as well psychologically. What does that entail? Like, how do these people feel doing these bad or good things? And what are the challenges? So it kind of goes into that. And that's how we utilize politics in another sense. The fictional universe helps because we don't want to say this country, that country. And we do want to have our own identity. So that is important because you want to disappear in a universe and then reflect back and kind of notice some things. So yeah, that's how we do it. Yeah, like amazing games, great stuff. Like I'm really loving how much personal connection there is to what we create, and something that sometimes a lot we don't think about when we look at a piece of art. But there's so much of the artist and so much of their motivations and emotions in there. So we can broaden it up a little bit and talk about what is the standing of games in the art scene? Like, where do you think, where are we right now, and where can we go?
Well, I would like to selfishly direct this question back to something we talked about earlier when we met before, when Ziba was asking, like, why aren't there more emotional games? But I thought that was like a really interesting question and a point, like, that we talked about how people don't necessarily understand that games can go into this territory. They think of games as like very much one genre or flavor of story. I think that in mainstream circles, like especially for me this was my first game, so I had been a writer for many years across different mediums, and I had no idea the sophistication that is existing in narrative games, and I was completely impressed and fell in love with it. But I think that we haven't quite reached that point where we've made it mainstream for a variety of reasons, both like barrier to entry, like playing games sometimes is hard, and also just, I think, getting into the consciousness that like games can do this kind of stuff. Like story can be more than just like shooting people.
Yeah,
I think part of it is I still feel like, and maybe this is some nutty historical perspective, but I feel like we're emerging from an era where you had to have these creative and technical, you had to have the same people doing a lot of the work, right? You had someone who had to be able to work deeply with a game engine or write their own and tell a compelling story. And in terms of like, compare that to an author, it'd be someone who has to write a great novel and know a lot about bookbinding, like what kind of glue should they use, and then just run off and go do the business of selling it all themselves, although a lot of authors still have to do a lot about business. But I think we're getting into a better spot where we can have this better division of labor, even if it's external to your company, you're buying game engines. And as cheesy as Unity's democratizing game development slogan is, I think that's actually a really great thing. I am very excited every time someone says, well, this is my first game, and they make something amazing, or they're like, I don't come from a games background. I'm like, fantastic. I come from a games background, so I'm crapping on myself here, but like, I love it when people like wander into the industry, like my head's full of other things from other places, and I'm now going to express it through games because they're finally accessible enough for me to do this, and they bring something amazing and new.
Oh, I think you're muted. Yeah.
If I might add to this, yes, I think a lot. One of the reasons we don't see that many games, I think, well, first of all, I believe that we see way more games like this than we did a couple of years ago. So that a lot of this is happening. But I think one of the reasons is, and this might have to do with what you just said, is if I'm coming from a games background and I experienced this myself and I saw this with other people, that you have this idea of what a game is supposed to be, right? What a game needs to have. You need to be able to win, and you need to have these fail conditions, and it needs to have these rewards, and it needs to be a pleasure machine in a way. And some of this is in conflict with interesting narratives, especially if it is dictating the narrative, right? If it says like, yes, if you want to tell a game story, then it needs to be a power fantasy because you're a player and you have agency, and therefore your character needs to have power, and otherwise, but this makes only so many stories, right? And at one point we have all seen them, and I think we are seeing right now, we're beginning to see games that explore other paths by taking away this idea of power from players and say like, hey, we put you in a situation where you are kind of powerless. And you still have agency, but not that much. You just need to go with the flow, and maybe not all the villagers in the village of Fantasyland are waiting for you to solve all their problems, but they have their own agency and they are interesting characters on themselves and stuff like this. And you're just one person wandering a world, exploring a world. And I think this is, yes, as I said, this is sometimes in conflict with like conservative game design as we're used to it, and we're still figuring out how to bring both together, right? Because there's reasons why good game design also works this way, but yeah, I believe it's a process, and we're getting there. That's yeah.
I think it's a matter of audience expectations as well. As we figure out how to kind of play with these ideas and incorporate these things into games, the audience also is kind of learning to expect those things from games, hopefully. Certainly, I think anyone who's made a game with a disempowering moment in it has heard the feedback that's not a good game, right? Like, oh, no one's going to buy this. Like, you can't save the world, you can't do all this stuff. And I think that as we continue to make more very interesting and compelling experiences in this vein, I hope that people will also see the value in that, and audiences will come along on the ride with us, and you know, be able to make this like a viable thing to actually do as our as the kind of, I guess, commercially is what I'm talking about. You know, previously this type of game has been associated with a very like artsy kind of, it's not necessarily for big sales. It's like, oh, I'm just making this kind of artsy game where you don't have a lot of power and it's about emotions and things like that. But lately I have a little bit more hope that these kinds of games are being more commercially successful and more accepted by audiences. People are realizing the kinds of things you can do with games, and that gives me hope for the, you know, for the future of this medium.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I do want to comment on the whole win-lose condition thing. I think we take a lot from our psychology that we apply to real life into games. Like, we also define a lot of things like win or lose in life as well. And I think that's why in games we do want to have a win or lose. But yes, that narrows down everything so much. There's so much more nuance and gray areas that we can like narratively put out there when we say there is no straight win, there is no straight lose, or maybe there is no win or lose, right? This is an experience. And sometimes an experience is just an experience. It doesn't need to be defined by any clear boundaries, right? There are so many unique games out there that kind of say we are different, and they execute that. So and they work, and they're just, why not? You know, there's just, the space is so much wider and broader than we kind of that we confine ourselves to, and has great potential. So yeah, that's my thought on it.
I think that games, like from a commercial standpoint, could potentially lean into that, and that could be a selling point. That, like, as opposed to a movie, like, to make a comparison, perhaps a crude comparison, but like you have a film like Schindler's List, you know you're going to feel pretty sad. It's going to be a 2-hour experience. Then you have Jörg's game, you're going to have a range of complex emotions dealing with a similar topic, and games allow you to explore those nuances and the complexity, that things aren't just so black and white, like not just like a heavy one emotional experience, which, I mean, I think it could be seen as like a barrier to some people, but actually is like maybe the main selling point of this type of storytelling.
I wonder whether part of it is, I guess, it sounds like a very obvious thing to say, but the industry is still pretty young. If you think about how long we've been telling stories for, or making music for, or writing books for, you know, even it's very young. And I've forgotten where I was going with that, but yes.
Well, I love that you're hanging out around like the definition of what is it we're doing here. We're still figuring it out, which leads to like a thing that I hit with kind words a lot is this a game? Like half of my reviews on Steam actually say this is not a game, but they're positive reviews. They're still happy to be there.
It doesn't matter.
I think Valve was using the term game-shaped object. I don't know if they coined that, but they're using that to describe mostly like scam things, trying to like sell the cards and achievements and whatnot. I may have made a game-shaped object, and I'm cool with that. And I think maybe we need that's one way for us to explore how do we put in broader narratives and experiences and grow the medium is to try to make things that aren't quite games.
Yeah, I really like that notion of it. I definitely think that when we get away from the idea of classifying games as like specific products and think more about, when we say games, thinking about them as kind of a grammar or a set of tools and techniques that we can use to apply to something. So instead of saying I'm making this product that goes in a box that people buy and interact with as its own thing, what I'm doing is I'm using this language that games has to say something, right? And the language of games is like these interactivity things that we have, and the grammars of like, and verbs and so on, right? People use these types of things to describe game design. I think that like implying that we're sort of like putting them towards an expression that we want to do is an interesting way to think about that.
Yeah, and there's like, I mean, in Suzerain, we kind of want the player to feel a bit helpless without others as well. And getting because generally politics is such a hard and long subject, and you wouldn't want to put real politics in a game. But we just said, why not? Like, why cannot we, like, fully focus on a story perspective? There are a lot of games that focus on the more mechanical side of politics, like Democracy, for example. But why isn't there a game that fully focuses on the emotional, on the personal side? And that was an avenue that we thought wasn't explored. And we kind of went deeper into that. And there are so many other things to explore. There's so much more to do. And there's nearly infinite potential because of the flexibility of the medium and where it stands in the art sphere. You get a specific experience with movies, and these experiences may change emotionally. You get another with theater. You get all these things. But in games, I think we can get the wide variation of them all at the same time, and in different aspects. We get music, visual, the narrative. We get so much more. So it is a very powerful medium to challenge and to kind of explore new topics in. But yeah, I just want to thank you all for coming and attending the panel, saying all these very personal and great things about your games and what you're going through and how they came to be. Can we have each of the panelists pitch and talk a little bit about their games and kind of call out to people?
Okay, I'll jump in since I went first last time. It's NeoCab. You play as Lena, the last kind of Uber type driver in this futuristic city. And when you arrive there, your best friend goes missing. And so the only way to find her is through your connections with other passengers. Again, my name is Paula Rogers. You can find me at my website, paulacreative.com, or on Twitter at Paula_BOT.
Excellent.
Okay, next. The game is Through the Darkest of Times, and you play as a civilian resistance fighter in 1933 Berlin, and you try to resist as good as you can together with your group and get through the darkest of times.
Nice.
And yeah, I guarantee you that even though you think you know a lot about the Third Reich, you will still learn a lot. It will give you a new experience, and it's 20% off right now on Steam, so get it now.
Nice. Sure. My game is not for broadcast. It's in early access right now on Steam. You play as, well, you come into a broadcast studio to clean up as the cleaner and discover that you are actually left in charge of the news. And you have 4 cameras, and you're cutting between real live footage of actors that is hopefully incredibly silly and funny at times, and other times it starts to get a bit darker. You're also in charge of censoring bad language and later on other things. And yeah, it's available right now on Steam. It's not for broadcast.
Awesome.
I'll go. Eliza is a visual novel. It's about the use of technology to address mental health. In it, you play Evelyn, and you give therapy to people using an AI. You don't have any choice in the game up until the very end. I'll just say that. Nice. And it goes some very, I don't want to say dark places, but it goes some very real places. So check it out. It's on Steam for PC and Mac, and for Nintendo Switch. It's called Eliza.
Kind words, lo-fi chill beats to write to. All real people, anonymous, online. Write what you're afraid of or scares you or you're anxious about, and then respond to everybody's requests with words of comfort, and trade stickers and unlock chill music. Follow me at Pop Cannibal.
And last but not least, Suzerain, a political narrative game where you play as Anton Rayne in a fictional 1950s universe, where you discover psychology, politics, power, greed, corruption, and all the other good things in life. Make sure to check out our demo at LudoNarraCon. Thank you, everybody. And I can say, let the games begin at LudoNarraCon 2020.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye.